There are some truths that stay buried not because they are forgotten, but because the weight of them is too much for a quiet life to carry. We like to believe that our homes are sanctuaries, defined by the solid click of a deadbolt and the thickness of a wooden door. But a lock is only as reliable as the hands that have held the key. And sometimes, the person you are hiding from is already standing on your side of the threshold. The humidity in the apartment was heavy, the kind of stillness that suggested the air itself was holding its breath. Detective Elias Thorne stood in the center of Maya Vance's living room, his boots pressing into the plush carpet as he stared at the woman draped across her sofa like a discarded silk ribbon. There were no overturned chairs, no shattered glass, and no signs that she had ever tried to run for the door. Her phone sat on the coffee table next to a half-empty glass of red wine, the screen occasionally lighting up with notifications from friends who didn't yet know she was gone. Elias walked toward the heavy oak front door, his gloved fingers tracing the frame with a methodical, practiced slowness. The deadbolt was thrown from the inside, and the chain was still engaged when the first responders had arrived, forcing them to use a hydraulic ram to gain entry. Forensic technicians were already dusting the handle, but Elias knew what they would find before the first puff of powder hit the metal. The wood wasn't splintered near the strike plate, and the window seals in the bedroom were intact, 30 stories above the concrete pavement of the city. In the hallway, his partner, Sarah Miller, was speaking with the building manager, a man whose complexion had turned the color of gray ash. The manager kept fumbling with a heavy brass ring of master keys, the metal clinking rhythmically as his hand shook with a visible, rhythmic tremor. He insisted that the building's security system was top of the line, featuring encrypted fobs and cameras that monitored every inch of the lobby. According to the digital logs, no one had entered Maya's floor for 6 hours prior to the estimated time of death. Sarah stepped away from the manager and joined Elias, her notebook flipped open to a page filled with neat, cramped handwriting that mirrored her focused intensity. She explained that Maya had lived here for 3 years and worked as a freelance graphic designer, mostly keeping to herself and a small circle of colleagues. The only people with keys to this specific unit were Maya herself and the building management office, which kept their spares in a biometric safe. Elias looked back at the body, the silence of the room feeling more like a physical pressure against his eardrums than a lack of sound. The investigator knelt by Maya's side. He observed slight discoloration around her neck, suggesting pressure was applied in a specific area. There were no signs of struggle on her hands, indicating she may not have resisted or was taken by surprise. The situation felt unnervingly swift, almost bypassing natural reactions. Elias felt a chill, a feeling he recognized from his early days on the job. Later that evening, the precinct was a hum of low-level electricity, the flickering fluorescent lights casting long, distorted shadows across the bullpen walls. Sarah tossed a folder onto Elias's desk, her face set in a grim expression that told him the night was only beginning for both of them. It was a cold case file from 3 months ago involving a young man found dead in his bathroom across town under nearly identical circumstances. He had been a high-rise dweller too, living in a modern complex with state-of-the-art security and a door that had been locked tight from the inside. Elias flipped through the crime scene photos, seeing the same lack of struggle and the same eerie domestic peace that had defined the Vance apartment. In that case, the police had eventually ruled it a freak accident or a suicide, despite the lack of a clear mechanism, simply because they couldn't explain how an intruder could have vanished. But seeing the two cases side by side, the pattern began to emerge like a photograph developing in a darkroom tray. Both victims lived in buildings that had been renovated by the same development firm within the last decade. They began a deep dive into the history of the Vance building, tracing its lineage through decades of corporate mergers and architectural handoffs. It had originally been an old textile warehouse before being gutted and turned into luxury lofts during the mid-2000s real estate boom. In the basement archives of the city's building department, they found the original blueprints and a list of subcontractors who had worked on the internal hardware. One name appeared on the invoices for nearly every high-end renovation project in the district: a defunct locksmithing service called Apex Security. The service had been a small, specialized operation run by a man named Julian Vane, who was known for his mastery of complex mechanical locking systems. He didn't just install deadbolts, he designed them, creating intricate internal mechanisms that were supposedly pick-proof and impossible to bypass. Sarah found a record indicating that Vane had lost his business after a series of legal disputes regarding tenant privacy and unauthorized access. His company had folded overnight, leaving behind thousands of locks installed in the most exclusive residences across the city. Elias spent the early hours of the morning looking into Julian Vane's personal history, finding a trail of residential addresses that ended abruptly 5 years ago. Vane had been a ghost since then, with no tax filings, no driver's license renewals, and no presence on any social or professional networks. However, a police report from his final year of business caught Elias's eye, detailing a complaint from a former client who claimed Van had been seen inside her apartment. She hadn't been robbed or harmed, but she swore that the furniture had been moved by mere inches while she slept. As the sun began to bleed over the horizon, painting the city in shades of bruised purple and orange, Elias walked back to the evidence locker. He requested the lock cylinder that had been removed from Maya Vance's door, holding the cold metal in his palm as if it could whisper its secrets. Upon closer inspection, he noticed a tiny, microscopic etching on the interior housing of the cylinder, visible only under a jeweler's loupe. It was a serial number, but it wasn't one that corresponded to the official manufacturer's records or any standard inventory list. He spoke to Sarah, his voice tired. He explained that these were not ordinary locks, but special systems with a unique entry method known only to the creator. The person had not just secured these areas, but made a main path that bypassed all electronic records and checks. He then realized that the person did not need to enter without permission, because entry was always allowed for them. They returned to the Vance apartment building, this time heading straight for the basement where the HVAC and utility tunnels were located. These older buildings were honeycombed with service corridors that bypassed the main lobbies, hidden behind heavy metal doors that most residents never even noticed. Elias moved his flashlight beam across the walls, looking for any sign of recent passage in the thick, undisturbed layers of industrial dust. Near a rusted drainage pipe, he saw a single clear footprint that didn't belong to any of the building's maintenance staff. The footprint led toward a crawl space that had been boarded up years ago, according to the manager's outdated and incomplete records. Elias pried the boards back, the wood groaning in protest as he revealed a narrow, dark passage that smelled of stale air and old grease. It was a vertical maintenance shaft, one that ran the entire height of the building, connecting to the plumbing voids behind the bathroom walls. As he looked up into the darkness, he realized that a person who knew the layout could move between floors without ever stepping into a hallway. Sarah signaled him from a few yards away, pointing toward a small, inconspicuous metal box mounted near the base of the elevator's mechanical housing. Inside the box was a collection of keys, each one labeled not with an apartment number, but with the names of the current tenants. Elias recognized Maya's name on a small plastic tag, the key attached to it looking pristine and unused, glinting under his flashlight. This wasn't just a hiding spot. It was a library of lives, organized and indexed with the terrifying precision of a predator. As they stood in the quiet basement, the sound of the elevator motor suddenly started somewhere far above them. The cables vibrated with tension as the car began its slow descent to the lower levels. Elias and Sarah looked at each other with sudden understanding, preparing their equipment as they moved toward the service doors. They were not just investigating a series of crimes. They were inside the very system the perpetrator had created to carry them out. The elevator car hissed to a stop, the doors sliding open to reveal an empty, dimly lit interior that smelled faintly of ozone and floor wax. Elias stepped inside, his eyes scanning the stainless steel walls for any sign of a hidden compartment or a modified control panel. He noticed a small, circular indentation near the floor, almost invisible against the decorative molding that didn't match the building's standard design. When he pressed it with the tip of his boot, a small panel clicked outward, revealing a manual override switch that had been spliced into the main wiring. Sarah stayed on the ground floor, monitoring the building's security feed from a tablet she had commandeered from the panicked manager. She watched the flickering black and white monitors, her eyes darting between the various camera angles that covered the exits and the service stairwells. On the screen for the third-floor landing, a shadow flickered briefly, a distortion in the grainy footage that suggested someone was moving just out of the light's reach. She whispered into her radio, her voice a sharp, urgent tether to reality in the oppressive silence of the basement. Elias ascended the stairs instead of using the elevator, his movements fluid and silent as he navigated the narrow concrete steps of the fire exit. Every floor he passed felt like a different layer of a vertical tomb, the muffled sounds of television sets and distant laughter leaking through the heavy fire doors. He reached the 10th floor and paused, his hand resting on the cold metal handle as he listened for the rhythmic scrape of a footfall or the click of a latch. The air in the stairwell was colder here, carrying a faint scent of metallic dust and something sharp, like machine oil. Back in the bullpen the following afternoon, the investigation took a turn toward the psychological as they analyzed the victims' personal histories. Sarah discovered that every person targeted had recently made a change to their home, a new rug, a repaired faucet, or a rekeyed lock. Julian Vane wasn't just choosing people at random. He was watching for moments of vulnerability or domestic transition that allowed him to justify his presence. He was a perfectionist who viewed the city's architecture as a living organism, one that he had a divine right to maintain and manipulate. They tracked down a former apprentice of Vane's, an older man named Arthur, who lived in a cluttered workshop filled with the skeletons of antique clocks and brass gears. Arthur spoke of Vane with a mixture of profound professional respect and genuine, deep-seated terror, describing him as a man who could hear a lock's heartbeat. Vane believed that a house was never truly yours as long as someone else held the blueprints, and he took pride in knowing the secret geometry of every room he worked on. According to Arthur, Vane hadn't just disappeared, he had retreated into the, quote, spaces between the walls. The more they dug into the blueprints of the city's high-rises, the more they realized how many dead spaces existed. Voids left by architectural errors or abandoned ventilation shafts. These were the places where Vane lived, a shadow existence conducted in the dark, three-dimensional maze of the city's infrastructure. He didn't need a home of his own when he had access to hundreds of bedrooms, kitchens, and private sanctuaries. He was a silent ghost in the machine, watching the inhabitants of his creations live their lives with the detached curiosity of a scientist. A third victim was found 2 days later, this time in a penthouse suite that was supposedly the most secure residence in the metropolitan area. The victim was a high-profile defense attorney who had spent thousands of dollars on biometric scanners and reinforced steel plating for his primary entrance. Like the others, he was found in a state of repose, tucked into his bed with the covers pulled up to his chin, looking perfectly peaceful in death. The only anomaly was a single small brass key left on his nightstand, a mocking signature from a man who laughed at the concept of modern security. Elias spent hours in the evidence room, staring at that brass key until the shape of the bow and the pattern of the bitting were burned into his retinas. It was an older style, the kind used for heavy industrial padlocks or antique safes, but the metal was polished to a mirror shine. He took the key to Arthur's workshop, hoping the old man could identify the specific lock it was designed to open. Arthur took one look at the key and turned pale, his hands trembling so violently that he had to set the metal piece down on his workbench. Arthur explained that the key didn't open a door, but a very specific type of service hatch found in the steam tunnels beneath the city's oldest districts. These tunnels were the arterial system of the city, carrying heat and power to the massive buildings above, and they were largely unmapped by modern utility companies. Vane had been obsessed with these tunnels, claiming they were the only place where a man could truly be free from the observation of others. The key was an invitation, a breadcrumb dropped by a predator who was tired of playing the long game with the police. Sarah compared the digital map of the tunnel system to the site locations and found a main point below an unused subway station, one that had been closed in the 1970s due to building issues. But the plans showed it was next to the Apex Security Building. Elias understood how the information fit together, like a puzzle tied to the security locks. They were looking for a person who had created a hidden network within the city's infrastructure. They organized a tactical sweep of the abandoned station, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and the heavy sulfurous scent of the steam pipes. The walls were covered in decades of grime, but as they moved deeper, the environment began to change, becoming cleaner and more organized. They found a section of the tunnel that had been outfitted with modern lighting and a series of monitors that were hooked into the city's private security feeds. Julian Vane had been sitting here in the dark, watching 100 different lives play out in real time on his stolen screens. The screens displayed various office activities. Some showed individuals taking breaks, while others depicted groups interacting during meals. Unbeknownst to them, their activities were being observed from a different location. Elias noticed a camera directed towards a section he recognized as Sarah's workspace, positioned on the ceiling close to her desk. This awareness motivated him to increase his efforts and alter his conduct. Vane observed the employees and formulated future actions. Suddenly, the monitors all flickered at once, the images dissolving into static before being replaced by a single high-definition feed of the tunnel they were currently standing in. They saw themselves on the screens, their tactical lights cutting through the darkness like frantic, searching eyes. A voice crackled over the station's old intercom system, a dry, melodic sound that seemed to come from every direction at once. Vane thanked them for coming, his tone almost hospitable, as if he were welcoming guests into his private library rather than a tomb. The large metal doors at the ends of the passage closed quietly. The locking system clicked, the sound carrying through the big area. Lights on the screen started to flash in a regular rhythm. The air in the room grew warmer as the steam controls were turned on. Elias attempted to open the exit, but he knew it was futile before he even reached the handle. The lock was made by Vane. They were trapped by the very system they had come to fix. The heat increased as a watcher looked on from a concealed spot. The heat in the tunnel became a physical weight, thick, with the smell of wet rust and the high-pitched whistle of escaping steam. Elias and Sarah moved with a desperate, coordinated speed, using their heavy flashlights to tap the hinges of the steel doors, but the reinforced metal did not budge. They were breathing in shallow, ragged bursts as the moisture began to condense on their vests, turning their gear into a heavy burden. Above them, the hidden speakers hummed with the sound of Julian Vane's, breathing a slow, rhythmic cadence that suggested he was observing their rising concern. Sarah noticed a ventilation grate near the ceiling that looked less sturdy than the main exits. Elias helped Sarah reach the grate by providing a foothold. Sarah pulled herself up and used a tool to unscrew the bolts holding the grate. The grate came loose, revealing a dark shaft that smelled of cold air and dust. They walked down a tight corridor, their voices echoing in the small area. The way was bumpy, showing Elias's interest in the town's less visible buildings. Elias led the way, his arms brushing the walls until he found a metal cover that looked into a small fenced section. He removed the cover, climbed down to the ground, and then quickly looked around the office space. The room was a study of access control, its walls lined with thousands of duplicated keys, each one meticulously labeled with names, addresses, and even the specific hours when the occupants were most likely to be away. In the center of the space sat a workbench covered in delicate, precise tools and a series of wax molds taken from the locks of the city's most influential citizens. There were photographs pinned to the rafters, not of the occupants themselves, but of the interiors of their homes, captured from angles that suggested the photographer had been standing just inches away while they lived their private lives. A door at the back of the workshop stood slightly ajar, leading into a break room that looked eerily identical to the office of the first visitor, Maya Vance. Vane had recreated her sanctuary down to the specific brand of water on the table and the exact arrangement of the cushions on the sofa, a thoughtful reminder of his own efficiency. In the corner, a person sat in a high-backed chair, their face obscured by the shadows, their long, slender fingers tapping over the keys of a laptop as if they were playing a silent instrument. They did not turn around when they entered, their voice remaining as calm and steady as a person discussing the project timeline. Julian Vane discussed project responsibilities in a confident manner that made Elias feel concerned. He stated he had simply updated access to areas he designed when residents did not recognize the shared nature of the amenities. Vane believed a code represented a method of management that he could modify if a resident was not aware of their usage agreement. He stood, and the light showed a man with a regular face that would blend into any meeting. As Elias moved to secure Vane's hands, the locksmith offered a faint smile that conveyed a strong sense of purpose and quiet fulfillment. He stated that his apprehension would not halt his work, as he had already instructed many individuals in specialized techniques, dispersing them across various locations and professions. Vane's influence extended beyond his past actions, evident in the numerous custom security systems he had implemented, which continued to protect the public. The city operated as a complex network shaped by his efforts, and he had dedicated years to ensuring that security measures presented a facade of protection. The ride back to the precinct was conducted in a heavy, oppressive silence, the city lights flickering past the windows like a series of disjointed memories from a life they no longer recognized as secure. Vane was processed and placed in a high-security cell, but as Elias watched the heavy steel bars slide into place, he felt no sense of victory or finality. He thought about his own apartment, the simple deadbolt he had trusted for years, and the dozens of hands that had handled the blueprints of his building before he ever moved in. The case was closed on paper, but the psychological architecture of the city had been permanently altered, leaving behind a lingering sense of profound vulnerability. Late that night, Elias stood in front of his own front door, his key hovering just inches from the lock as he hesitated in the dim hallway light. He listened to the silence of his home, wondering if the faint creak of the floorboards was just the building settling or the sound of a shadow retreating into the walls. He realized then that he would never truly sleep soundly again, knowing that the most dangerous monsters don't need to break your windows or kick down your doors. They simply wait for the moment you feel most safe, using the very tools you bought to protect yourself to let themselves inside. The truth is that we are never as alone as we think we are, even in the deepest hours of the night. We build our lives around the comfort of boundaries, but those boundaries are often designed by people we will never meet and whose motives we can never truly know. Sleep well. But remember that a key is just a piece of metal, and the person who made it still knows exactly how it feels in the palm of their hand.